So thank you all for coming tonight for this important discussion of protecting our kids, the long-term impacts of lead poisoning. I'm Dwayne Brejak. I'm the Director of Member Services with NASW-Michigan. And tonight we're gathering for an important discussion on the long-term impacts of lead poisoning on children. The situation here in Flint has exposed failures across many systems, as we all have read about, lived, or advocated in many different arenas. We want you to know that NASW stands with you and with others working to eliminate health disparities in the Flint area, and are using our advocacy capacity to let the country know that the Flint public health crisis should never happen again. We hope that you will join us by adding your voice to the community organizing, the clinical organizing, and the policy work being done in the state. There's going to be lots of time for discussion, so please write down your questions as we're going through the workshop today. We'll have a question and answer session. We are recording, so other social workers can listen to this after. So we do have a mic that will be passed around for questions if you can kind of just wait for that. We'd like to give a special thanks to StoneCrest Center for their support today. Valerie's here from StoneCrest and really has been a wonderful partner with us on this event and many others. We also want to thank the University of Michigan-Flint, in particular Charles, Kim, and Kim, who you saw out at the registration desk, for helping us get the event space and just being wonderful social workers. We have a student poster if you want to make sure to check that out before you leave today. The students here did a lot of research and advocacy that I think we can all learn from. If you need continuing education, before you leave, make sure you sign out at the registration desk. If you don't sign out, we can't give you the CEs, so please make sure that you do that before you leave. So as we get started today, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Lauren O'Connell. Dr. O'Connell is a Developmental Behavioral Pediatrician at Hurley's Children's Center, it's a mouthful of the title, with expertise in effective parenting behaviors and toxic stress. She recently completed her fellowship in DBP and health service research at the University of Michigan. She's a lifelong Michigander and a pediatric advocate. She has been a wonderful partner with us at NASW and for social workers across the state, and was a keynote speaker at our conference last month. So will you all please join me in welcoming Dr. Lauren O'Connell.
So, thank you again for having me and for your patience as I arrived. So today, my goal is to really just get us all on the same page regarding the water crisis, what happened, the timeline, why we're concerned from a scientific perspective, and what are some next steps that can be taken. And hopefully, the talk shouldn't, the best part of this is always the questions and answers after, so I look forward to that. And if there's, I absolutely write stuff down, but if there's something burning and you really want to make sure you ask me while I'm on the slide I'm on, just raise your hand. That's great. So today we'll talk about the timeline, what happened when, and we'll specifically go over some of the findings briefly from the Hurley Michigan State research. And then we'll talk about lead from a scientific perspective and why it matters in the development of especially young children. The connection between lead and adverse childhood experiences. And then lastly, what we can do and what are some of the next steps. Primary prevention didn't happen, but we can do some secondary and tertiary prevention to minimize the impact of lead on Flint's kids. And of course, question and answers. So basically, in November 2011, the state-appointed leaders of Flint decided to switch the water, decided in April 2014 to switch the water from the Detroit supply to the Flint River. This was a decision based on cost savings. And pretty quickly, I'm trying to use this mouse in an odd way so that I can be visible to you all, but it means I'm clicking it a little awkwardly. Okay, I apologize. So pretty quickly, it became clear that the water was something was up with the water. It looked bad, it smelled bad, tasted weird, and immediately residents and community members began reporting that to various government agencies. in just within a few months, there were multiple fecal coliform and boil advisories. That means food bacteria. That's the translation of that. And then in October, the General Motors actually stopped using the water from the Flint River because it was corroding their parts. And to kind of work on that corrosion and to kill the bacteria, that requires different chemicals, and some of the byproducts from those chemicals were discovered to be at unsafe levels later that calendar year. So in February 2015, so a little less than a year after the switch, the EPA actually detected high lead levels, and it was known that there were toxic levels of lead in the water. And then in August 2015, some outside researchers came in from Virginia Tech. This fellow, Mark Edwards, he's a really great guy. He's a PhD, and he has done work across the country around lead in water, and has really been pushing for this to be an issue across the country, something people think about. And he came to Flint because of what he'd been hearing from the community members, and did a study that showed, again, elevated levels of lead in the water. Researchers from Hurley, especially Dr. Monahana Atisha, you may have heard of, also became involved and did some research looking at lead levels in blood, and specifically in the blood of children in Flint. So this is about water, lead levels in the water. And what you can see is that before the switch, there was already a discrepancy between non-Flint zip codes, so where there was only less than 1% had elevated lead levels in their water, and all Flint zip codes where there was over 2%. But then post-switch, the non-Flint zip stayed statistically essentially the same, around 1% had an elevated level of lead in their water. But the Flint zips, and especially the high-risk Flint zips, had more than double. So not only did the amount of households, this is the percentage of households that had elevated lead levels in their water. So not only did that increase, but the discrepancy also increased, the difference, which is what makes it a strong argument that it was actually the switch to the different water. Similarly, they then looked, this is Hurley's work specifically, Hurley looked at, depending on where the water lead level was, where were there increases in blood levels, because just because it's in the water doesn't necessarily mean it's in the blood. And they again found that there was this more than doubling of the percentage of people, of kids, with elevated lead levels. And an elevated lead level is greater than 5. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So why did this happen? Well, there was a few things that made Flint sort of this perfect storm for lead entering the water. First of all, the Flint River water did not have lead in it, so that's an important kind of take home. There wasn't lead in the water itself. The water itself had a corrosive pH acidity level, and so that is not uncommon. It's something that can be controlled for, but that didn't happen. And so this corrosive water entered the pipes. And Flint, like many communities, has lead pipes, has a lot of lead pipes. Usually that's pretty safe because over time, a coating builds up on the inside of the pipes that means it's basically a lead oxide. So basically what it means is as water goes through, it never actually touches the actual lead. And so no lead gets into the water. Lead has been used in piping, in plumbing forever. Plumbing is actually named after the Latin word for lead. Like if you think of the periodic table, going way back, it's a PB for plumb. Anyway, so it's not an uncommon thing to have lead pipe. However, because of the corrosive nature of the water, it took that scale off, it ate that scale away, and then had access to the lead of the actual pipes, and was perfectly, horribly, chemically correct to actively pull the lead out of the pipes. So that was a problem, obviously. And then in Flint in particular, there is an aging infrastructure, as I'm sure many of you know, and so many of the lead pipes in Flint were not in optimal condition to start with, and so set up for more lead to get into the water. And because of the patchy population density, there would be areas where the water, the corrosive water, would sit in a pipe for a long time, not going through to be used, and so it just more and more leaching would occur. And then, eventually that water would move on to somewhere else. So all of these together kind of leads to the problem. One other thing to understand the complexity of the physical nature of the problem is that, especially with addressing the primary problem of the pipes, is that the lead pipes aren't only in the main water lines, they're also the lines off the service lines from the main pipes to the houses or the apartment buildings. They're also in the buildings. So it's not, and different people own all those parks. It's not that the city owns all those things. So it truly is quite so when you hear that there's all this competition and like, why hasn't this been fixed yet? That is something to be frustrated about. There's a lot to be frustrated about. But at the same time, it is truly a very, now that it's damaged, it's very, very challenging to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't cost the residents more money than it needs to, and that is provable that it's safe. Just that little, the other little, so I'm not an infrastructure expert at all, so please don't ask me any more questions about it. But one other thing that I've learned is that, so if you think about, there's a whole city under our feet, right, of infrastructure that we rely upon, and unfortunately, well, in this case, unfortunately, the water pipes are the lowest things down. So your electric, your gas, your phone, all that stuff that might be underground is above, higher up than the water line. So again, thinking about how to get to those main water lines is very complicated and involves a lot more than just digging them up, so to speak. Okay, so coming back to that, this great graphic that the Hurley team made of elevated water and blood levels, you can see that the red, the dark red on the map here, where the highest blood levels were, corresponds exactly with the red lines, which is where the oldest infrastructure is. So that's not proving per se that the one caused the other, but there's certainly a strong association, a strong relationship. It's pretty striking. Okay, so like I said, the percentage of kids with elevated blood levels increased, and they increased the most. They increased everywhere that there was Flint water, and they increased the most in areas where they also showed the highest water level. So a pretty clear chain of causality is what we call that, sort of logical flow there. And of note, our results likely underestimate exposure because these were all based on just the blood levels that we had in the Hurley system. And in general, those blood levels are checked around 18 months to 2 years. So we didn't check any infants, any younger kids. And indeed, the blood level, when you're acutely exposed to lead, like if you get a lot of it in your system one time, that goes away with it. That lead level is going to go back to normal within 20 to 30 days. If you have chronic exposure, it probably lasts longer, but still, we likely missed whatever those kids' peak lead levels were. So in any case, those numbers are not good, and they're likely an underestimate. Okay, so clearly this is demonstrating a failure, what I would call a failure of primary prevention. That's a pretty politically neutral way to say it. And we'll try to be politically neutral today. So then basically, Dr. Monahan and Tisha would publish with these results. And again, that's all I'll say about that. And then pretty quickly, the city kind of started to respond. They formed a health advisory. Then statewide there was a health advisory. Then a couple weeks later, they just declared a public health emergency. started filtering the water, testing the water, doing more corrosion control. Then about 3 weeks after the results were announced, during this testing, they found that at least three schools had very significantly elevated water lead levels. And so that was the point where the state decided to switch back to the Detroit water system. And that happened in October, mid-October. Okay, so why do we care? There's a lot of weird stuff in our water, and that's true, and we could spend days thinking and talking about that, but why was lead the thing that kind of prompted this switch back? And the reason that we as pediatricians are so concerned about lead is that it's a known neurotoxin. Our body doesn't use lead for anything normally, and so there's no safe lead level. There's a lot of things that if we get too much of them, they're not good, but we need to find a balance because our body needs a little bit. Lead's not like that. We don't need lead at all. And so this has been lead exposure has been a problem throughout the United States for a long time. It used to be, and still is, the most common route of exposure is in paint, because it was in lead paint. Lead was in paint as a solvent until the mid-70s. Similarly, it was in gasoline as a solvent until around that same time. So it's still in a lot of our homes. It's probably mine. And it's in a lot of soil, especially in industrial and post-industrial areas. So lead was already an issue in Flint. It's not to say that this has never been here before. However, because of efforts by public health folks and by pediatricians, we have had some success in getting lead out of those spaces, and so the lead levels are coming down, from a population sense. Unfortunately, where we have had more trouble bringing them down is in the exact communities where kids are already facing some challenges, because it's in those low-income communities where there maybe aren't the resources or the government investment to do remediation, to do soil cleaning, to go through and help people advocate with their landlords to get the paint changed, etc. Those are the communities where lead is still sticking around. Again, Flint is a place where there was already a disproportionate number of kids being impacted by this. So again, because there's no safe blood level, the CDC and all other advocacy bodies recommend primary prevention. And that is, again, because once it's in the body, we don't have a great way of getting it out. So it's once it's there, it's a problem. And as we've been, I'm going to get into specifically housing problem in a second, but just a little more you didn't know you were going to come to a chemistry class, I'm sorry. So lead in water is different. We're used to lead in paint and soil, where the primary route of exposure is by eating it. And so kids, and that's why we test at the ages that we test. We test in that toddler age when kids are most likely to be licking the windowsills and putting dirt in their house, right? It literally happens that way. So so we kind of know about these as public health advocates and as pediatricians, kind of know how that exposure works and who to think about for that. But with water, it's a different ballgame. It's dissolved instead of a particle. You're getting it through drinking and through cooking, so it's a different population that's at risk. And it's also tricky because it's coming out of these pipes where we don't know exactly where the lead is in the pipe, and which can lead to sort of these patchy exposures where if you test the water and if we know that there's active lead coming through the system, so in Flint, unless there's proof that the whole system has been fixed, you can't be 100% confident that a house that tests normal for lead one day is going to continue to test normal, because basically little patches of lead and patches of the corrosion can flake off, and then you can have an increase. Again, a lot of people who have thought about lead for a long time are having to learn pretty quickly on the fly what does lead in water mean for our communities. So one of the things that we're learning is that it again, disproportionately affects younger kids. So if you think about, and part of this is math, and part of this is how they get their nutrition. So first of all, babies, especially formula-fed babies, are getting all their nutrition through mixed with water. And so if it's being made with water that has a high level of lead, they're getting exposed to a lot of lead. And secondly, the math issue is just that one of the reasons that the smaller you are, the more exposed you get, is that, if I drink a glass of water that has lead in it, and a baby gets a bottle that has the same amount of lead, there's just less blood in that baby for the lead to go into. And so they're going to end up with a higher level than if I had it. So that's concerning, and we pediatricians don't regularly screen infants for lead, so it's something we need to think about how to approach. And there is a documented risk to unborn babies as well. There's some evidence that there's an increase in miscarriage and an increase in decreased birth rates. Those are things that are still being investigated, but there's evidence for those things. Okay, so lead in general, what's the problem? So I mentioned that a couple times that we don't use lead in any way. The problem is that lead looks a lot to chemically, lead looks very similar to nutrients that our bodies do use, so namely calcium and iron. So remembering way back to high school chemistry and that periodic table, and if you can remember that when we abbreviate different metals especially, we'll often put little numbers by them. And so, for example, calcium would be abbreviated Ca2+. And that's because of chemistry and electrons and all kinds of stuff we don't need to worry about, but that I try really hard not to think about. But basically, iron is also 2+, or 3+, but 2+, and lead is also 2+. And so our body knows certain proteins and certain reactions look for that 2+. And that's all, it's not, that's what it looks for and that's what it grabs onto, especially in the brain and in the bones. And so when lead is in the blood, the body doesn't know the difference, it just sees 2+, and so it pulls it in to those locations in the body, the brain, and the bones. The bones, it doesn't do much bad, it hangs out there, and that might have impact, we'll talk about that later, but it doesn't cause harm. But in the brain, it can cause harm. And so in the brain, where the lead tends to go and affect the structures and the connections, the pathways, in two main parts of the brain. One is the amygdala, which is deep in the center of our brain, and one is the frontal cortex, which is in the front. And it's involved. The pathways are those that are involved in the basically the cortisol axis. And I'm saying this because it matters for things that it matters for what behaviors you see, and it matters because other things impact those structures too. So those are the areas of the brain that lead impacts. So first of all, there is an association between elevated blood lead levels and a decrease in IQ. And you'll see here that just a small change in lead level can drop your IQ about 4 points. Okay, so for an individual, this may not end up mattering very much. So IQ is measured on what's called a normal curve, and the middle normal is 100. But see lots of math, lots of learning today. But the normal range is anywhere 15 points on either side, so anywhere 85 to 115. That's normal. And to change categories, you have to go down 15 points. So you're not considered below average until you're at 70, et cetera. So if you were destined, and we would never really know this, but if you were destined to have an IQ of 110 and you dropped 4 points, well, now you're at 106. Nobody's really going to notice that, right? Of course, if you have a higher blood level, your IQ may drop more, so that individual may be affected. But what's really concerning is that if a population is exposed to lead, that whole population's IQ is shifted lower, or could be shifted lower. And so that's going to shift the whole curve. So you're going to decrease the number of kids who are out on the high end, right? You're going to increase the kids who are on the low end and need services, etc. So that's a pretty, even though that's a small number for an individual, for population it can still be very significant. And of course, kids with lower IQ are at risk for a lot of things, and they require a lot of help and require a lot of resources, both when they're young and also when they're older. Okay, so going back to those specific structures, lead also has pretty significant, can have pretty significant impact on behaviors. So the amygdala is the part of our brain that regulates emotion and emotional response. So kids who have been lead exposed have been demonstrated to have pretty dysregulated response to emotions, and that's not this. None of these things are unique to lead per se. Other things cause this too. I feel like, especially in this crowd, I can ask you to imagine some individuals. So imagine a kid who's just like really hard to like. They don't tend to respond the way you expect them to. They get angry, they get mean. Those kids who we know because of our training that just because they're hard, the fact that they're the hardest to love means they need the most. But the fact is, it's very challenging to interact with them. So lead exposure could cause that kind of a phenotype, that kind of a look. It also, so that frontal lobe is the part of our brain that is in charge of planning, that is in charge of saying, do this, not that, that's in charge of saying, that was an interesting idea, but maybe you should raise your hand first. All that kind of executive function, if you've heard that phrase. So lead exposure impacts that, and it can look like, and not in fact be diagnosed as ADHD. So those sort of, that lack of inhibition, so to speak. And of course, those types of behaviors and emotional dysregulation, regardless of their cause, are associated with a lot of long-term risk behaviors and poor choices leading into adulthood, as well as other health effects. Okay, so this slide, I don't want to belabor this point because my reading has indicated that this evidence may not be as strong as we've been reporting, but basically, so we talked about the direct effects of lead on the individual, and I just want, I've reordered some stuff, sorry, it doesn't match the handout exactly. So I just want to highlight that lead may also have impact beyond the individual in the sense that changes in the individual may be able to be passed down. So there's an emerging field of something called epigenetics, which is basically the idea that our genetic code is super important, but there's also a lot of other factors that play into how the genetic code is expressed in an individual and in a lifetime. And a lot of the way that the genetic code's expression is determined is from these, what are called, number 3 on this diagram, gene regulatory proteins, okay? And basically, it is hypothesized, and in some cases demonstrated, that stuff from the outside, our environment, can impact those gene regulatory proteins, and that those changes can be passed on to their children and children's children. So again, this is an emerging field, but there is some evidence from Wayne State actually that lead is one of the environmental factors that may impact those proteins. So again, this is research that we need to know more about this, and this is not like a doomsday alarm, but it's just another factor to think about that it may be more than just an individual kid. Okay, so basically where are we at? So basically we've had this population-wide exposure. It was preventable, and it wasn't prevented. The whole community is traumatized, as you are witnessing firsthand, and likely more so than I am. There's been a huge loss of trust in government and institutions across the city. Frankly, it's a scandal, right? It's an utter scandal what has happened in the old-fashioned pre-Shonda use of that term. So, and of course, the community during this time of trauma is getting tons of attention, That's going down a little bit, and I actually think that's probably a good thing. The media spotlight attention going down a little bit. Frankly, the scientific attention and the desire to help from people who have resources is still very high, so that's good. And of course, the federal state of emergency, and the folks from the federal government have actually been fabulous. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to work with any of the folks from SAMHSA or other places, but I've been very impressed with their leadership, but also their very clear understanding that they are facilitators. They are not solving a problem. The community is capable of, and therefore should solve the problem. So that's been pretty impressive to me. Okay, so that's the science of lead and why we care. And I just think sometimes we gloss over why we care, and I think when we explain to families why we're worried and why we're not, when we're not super worried, that can be helpful. Before I get on to these broader issues, a few other points about lead exposure that often come up. So one is about whether you can be exposed to lead by showering or that sort of thing. And the answer is no. So lead is a heavy metal and it cannot be absorbed through the skin. And so I had people ask, well, what about inhaling the steam? Is that dangerous? And in fact, actually no, and that connects back to boiling. So you've probably heard, don't boil the water to get rid of lead, right? Absolutely true. The tricky part is sometimes there's bacteria and you do need to boil the water to kill the bacteria, but it doesn't help with the lead at all. In fact, it concentrates the lead in the water. So again, lead is a heavy metal, and so when you boil the water, it's too heavy to go up with the steam. And so the lead stays in the hot water, and so just simple math, like if you started with like say 5 parts of lead in the water, but now you've gotten rid of some of the water, so now it actually is like 10 to 1 the ratio. And so similarly in the shower, the steam isn't going to have lead in it; it's too heavy to go into the steam. That's not to say that all the crazy skin stuff we've been hearing about is not connected to the water, but it's not connected to the lead in the water. There's plenty of other stuff in the water. So, or there was. I think once it's just switched back, there's just a lot of, it's up there. But it's not the lead. And then, I had another little thing I wanted to say. I'm going to go back and see if I can trigger it from my other. Okay. I guess that the only other thing I would say before moving away from the science is that the impact on an individual kid in Flint is one of risk. There's this, so I've just laid out all this stuff that's very scary and that's very sad. But the fact is that we don't know for any individual kid what their exposure was, and nor would knowing what their exposure was tell us predict specifically for that kid what their outcome would be. And so we'll get to hopeful things at the end, but I wanted to take a moment to be hopeful right now because the effect sizes of lead are in meaningful things. Like the effects of lead are on our brains and on our emotions, and that's really meaningful. But for the individual person, the effects are most often very small. So it's a meaningful thing, but the size of it is small. And so if you can help us by communicating to your families that, yes, we want to know as much about this as possible, and yes, for the individual kid, we want to do as much as possible, but the impact of lead for that individual child, frankly, is likely to be pretty small compared to many of the other things that child is already encountering in our community. So it's in many ways, the attention, the awareness of the impact of lead is in some ways an opportunity to leverage that attention and frankly the resources, by which I mean money, that is coming, to do interventions that help kids with lead exposure and also help all kids. So that's what we'll get to at the end. And I remember my other point. So I've heard a lot about, the other question I get a lot of times is, should we check blood level? And the answer is no, because, on a population level. So the reason why we shouldn't go around checking all the households for blood level is, lead in the blood is because, again, that half-life issue, if there's an acute exposure, it goes away very quickly. And even with a chronic exposure, it goes away over time. And hypothetically, these families, most families have been having using either filtered water or the water from the switchback line for months. Obviously, there are issues with that, very much so. But most families, for many families, that's true. So that child, what I don't want to happen is a family to check their blood level and see that it's normal and be like, oh, we're fine. When in fact, it could be normal because they've not been being exposed for a while. Doesn't mean they weren't. That didn't at some point have a high level. So to just do universal screening would likely give a lot of false negatives. That said, if there's an individual family who is concerned that their blood levels in their water are still high, they should check those first. And if they are high, they should absolutely get a blood level checked in that individual. So that's something that should be talked about with their medical home and figured out on the individual basis, rather than just say, everybody gets screened. And we, and by we I mean kind of Dr. Mona Hanna-Tisha and other folks advocating from Hurley, have convinced the state and other funders and regulatory folks to just consider Flint folks in Flint universally exposed and to not require demonstration of a blood level test to get any services that may evolve or exist. That's not a requirement. So that's true already and has been true, but just so that's very clear. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress, and that's because they impact the same biology, the same biologic structures as lead do. So basically, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are traumatic events that happen in childhood and can have lasting effects on health and well-being. This all sort of started in the late 90s, and the awareness of these kind of, I mean, again, you all know this, you know this intuitively and anecdotally and all that stuff, but basically there's growing evidence that social parts of life impact health and the long-term outcomes of people. Here are some of the experiences that are considered an adverse childhood experience. You can see that they're pretty extreme, right? But they're very common. And this is the proposed model for how it might impact health, where you start with these experiences, you disrupt neurodevelopment, and then there's increasingly negative experiences or consequences as you go forward in life. Now a word about toxic stress. So toxic stress is a physiologic response. It's a pathophysiologic response. That means it's not good. Everybody has stress. Stress in itself is something that our bodies actually do on purpose. And regular stress, which in this on this slide is called positive, is a normal part of our lives, and it's necessary. Positive is a bit of a misnomer because it's not like it ever feels good. But if you, as a child, are getting a shot, if it's your first day of school, if you're giving a talk, if you're running late for a talk, for example, you're going to feel a certain level of stress, and that is appropriate. And your body will feel that stress. You will be revved up. It's the fight or flight response. It's related to the fight or flight response. Sorry, Dr. Garner. And you will press harder on the accelerator. You will do other things in reaction to that stress. Okay? And then it goes back down, and that's fine. There are also stressors that are longer lasting or more intense. So breaking a bone hurts more than getting a shot. Getting fired is a much more stressful experience than being late, and they last longer. And so again, your stress response goes up, and it'll take longer to go down. But that's still an appropriate response. It's still helping you respond to something that's really there. However, if you have too rapid positive or tolerable stress incidents, where you're starting to come down, but then you're up again. Over time, your body resets itself, and so your set point is now up. And basically, you are in that stress state all the time, and your body can't quite figure out how to respond to that, and so you often sometimes may have paradoxical reactions where you react really strongly to something that's not a big deal, or you don't react at all to something that is a big deal. And this is the experience of kids and people who have been abused, who live in poverty for a very long time, who are exposed to violence, and so toxic stress is really common. And the areas that it impacts in your brain, that sustained level, that new set point, are a very long name for a set of pathways that are in the frontal cortex and the amygdala. Okay, so those words may sound familiar, because those are the areas that lead impacts. And basically, this last bullet point is just to remind me to say that all of these things that impact the brain can impact adult brains too, right? We don't talk a lot about lead in adults because it's not likely that adults are getting a high enough blood level for there to be an impact. But toxic stress absolutely impacts adults in their current lives. However, even if it does impact adults, things that affect neurodevelopment impact kids more. And the younger they are, the more it impacts them, because their brains are actively changing, they're actively determining the pathways they'll have later. There's a lot going on, and so it very directly impacts them. Toxic stress, the interaction between toxic stress and lead is a great example of this model, which basically says that we can't think about any just one piece of the puzzle to understand an individual or even a population's outcomes, because really it's the lead, it's the nutrition, it's the impact of poverty, it's the impact of stress. So all of those things together have to be considered. And these are the kids of Flint with all these risk factors. Now we've added lead on top of it, which is just a crying shame and again a scandal. However, I actually think this slide points out that yes, lead exposure is terrible, 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 but it is not the only thing we need to think about in these kids, and it's just one arrow. So the fact that it happened is horrible, and we need to think about how to respond to it. But for the individual kid, it needs to just be considered one piece of a much larger, much more complicated picture. Okay, so that's the take-home points about these. Okay, so now what can we do? So basically, there's still some need for making the water safe. It's pretty clear that there's still homes with toxic levels of lead in their water. It's pretty clear that, well, as of like a month ago, I could say that some families still didn't have filters or know about bottled water. I think we've reached most pockets by now, and by we, I don't actually even mean me, but the people in the Flint community are actively working on that. So that part's, I think, much improved. But obviously, as we talked about at the beginning, the long-term solution to this problem is not clear how to make the water safe. And just the fact that families have to drink bottled water all the time, like that is so stressful and traumatic, frankly. So, as I mentioned, there's really this, there is an opportunity to leverage some of this into building interventions that cross sectors, that involve social workers and educators and physicians thinking about these issues together, which we've all been thinking about for a long time. But this may prompt us to build some things together. Hurley has partnered with Michigan State to create this pediatric public health initiative, and their goals are to assess how many children are still being exposed, to monitor their development, but also to intervene. And basically, I'm going to skip through this a little bit. It's just a lot of repeating. Building resilience. So we already know, we know from, unfortunately, all the folks who've been exposed to lead through other ways, we know what the best interventions are for kids with lead exposure. If you have really high, really acute lead exposure, like over 20, well, I think it's actually over 40. So if your lead level is over 40, which would mean very high and would mean you're physically feeling sick, there's this treatment called chelation that actually goes into the blood and actively pulls the metals out. It's a risky thing. It's not something that is recommended for people with blood load levels below that. And most of the blood load levels that we found in Flint are between like 7 and 10. So elevated for sure, but not something where it would be appropriate to go to that kind of medical treatment. Very risky. I say that because I'm hearing about it in clinic, and you may hear about it in your with your clients, and so just to back me up on that would be great. So what can we do? So one of the interesting approaches that's about kind of preventing the lead from interfering with the biology is nutrition. So we talked about how our bodies use lead because they think it's calcium or they think it's iron. So if you can have a diet that's rich in calcium and iron, you have a better chance of sort of flooding the system with what your body wants and needs, and giving lead less opportunity to go into those sites. So this is not about, this is about the recommendations are frankly the same recommendations we all have. It's just the typical, what's actually recommended for calcium and iron, but obviously I certainly don't get that unless I take them all the time. So it's still, there's still a lot of room to get folks there. But I say that just because it doesn't mean they have to be taking all these supplements, or, if they make a smoothie with some spinach in it, like they're gonna get their what they need. Now that sounds simple, but it's not easy at all. And so I don't want to minimize that, but just to say that it's that those are the recommendations around nutrition. And then from an education standpoint, it's very clear that just for every other issue that you saw pointing at that little kid, that little baby, early childhood education is a key protective factor, and there's also evidence that's protective against the impacts of lead. And so multiple folks, many folks in the community are working on this, and GISD and Flint Community Schools are very well aware and are, in a historic way, working together to tackle some of these issues. And frankly, the state is also very aware and has provided additional waivers and things like that. And the school nurse to student ratio, so that's going to improve because the state approved and the GISD got funding for additional school nurses to come in, so that's really great. Talked about nutrition. Just on the nutrition, I actually think there have been some really cool and very creative programming coming out of this community around nutrition. A lot of it involves the farmers market, which is such a great place. Every day that's open, there's people there, and if you come and you test what their sample is, they'll give you, so you get the food that you eat, but they'll also give you something like, they gave out collapsible measuring cups the other day, or just like cool stuff like that. And of course, the test kitchens are running recipes, and they're very, MSU Extension and Hurley have partnered with the farmers market to really have that curriculum that was already present and already very cool now be at least in line with the lead issues, even if they're not directly talking about lead all the time. And the MSU Extension that I've mentioned was really, from an institution perspective, taking the lead on a lot of the great programming coming out around nutrition. Hurley, the Hurley Clinic, has a grant now where they will write prescriptions for fruits and vegetables. And when they write the prescription, it prints from the computer, and it's a gift card to the farmers market. It was $5, now they've just got a new grant, now it's 10. So, and they have a full-time nutritionist on the same grant, a full-time nutritionist in the clinic who's actively counseling patients, but also overseeing that program and thinking about how to make it better. Because the farmers market is only open 3 days a week, they've actually partnered with specific vendors. The coupons are accepted by any vendor selling fruits and vegetables. They partnered with a couple specific ones who basically put $10 worth of fruit and vegetable into a bag, and then they leave it at the clinic. So even on days when the farmer's market's not open, you can redeem your prescription for a bag right then, and then the vendors get reimbursed. So it's there's nowhere in the country doing anything like this. I mean, there's nowhere else in the country where there's a clinic in the farmer's market, but, which is amazing. I mean, that's totally not this topic, but it's really cool. So anyway, so there's some really innovative things happening. So that's very helpful. And then on the medical health side, and really what I mean here is behavioral health. So one of the best ways to help protect kids from some of the more medical behavioral sides of impacts of the lead is to have them connected with a medical home, and to support that medical home to do appropriate screening and testing when needed. And that's where a lot of my work and projects are aimed right now, because that's my expertise. So Hurley's working with the schools to think about a universally offered assessment in the fall aimed at all types of development and behavior domains, but with the idea of helping families figure out what their kids need. We're also partnering with a lot of different people are thinking, a lot of different institutions have been tasked, and probably some of you are part of this, because of this new targeted case management mandate from the state, there's a need for around kids clear developmental behavior screeners, and the one that everyone seems to be picking is something called the Ages and Stages Questionnaire, or as I will call it, the ASQ. Has great parameters. It's a good one to use, and so since a lot of different institutions are thinking about using it, we're trying to figure out a way that information can all go into like one database, so that because physicians use the ASQ too, the school uses it too, so it would be pretty annoying as a family if everywhere you go, you're having to fill out the same form. And so we're trying very hard to build a database where, if I do it at my visit with a kid, I put it in, and the school can look and see that it happened, and what the score was, and whether follow-up was done. Because right now there's a system where you can look and see that it happened, but that's not very helpful if you don't actually know what the information is. So anyway, so that's another system-wide thing we're working on. We're going to bring, in Hurley specifically, we're going to bring in a parenting intervention program that runs during well-child visits. Just different innovative things like that. And that's just us. I know that other institutions are working on those types of things as well as Genesee Health System. So I already talked a little bit about our clinic and how amazing it is. I want to give a shout out to CHAP for sure, because they've been a fairly important partner. They collaborate with, they help coordinate all the different private care docs in the area, and CHAP specifically is pediatricians, and so obviously, we can do a lot at Hurley, but we don't see all the kids at all, and so anything that, basically we're trying to be kind of a laboratory at Hurley, and the things that are working really well, we're trying to just disseminate out through CHAP to all the other pediatricians, and vice versa, frankly. And Dr. Monahan-Atisha has been everywhere, and she is giving commencement addresses. She gave an amazing keynote talk at the American Academy of Pediatrics meeting a couple of weeks ago. Not to mention all these really famous people, and not just famous people, but people who hold different levers of power and resources, and who can actually get what we need into this community from money. I think it's important to just be talking about money. Okay, and we have this fund that's interconnected with the PPHI. So basically, their goal is to provide funding support, grant support to anyone in the Flint community who has a good idea about how to help the kids. And while it's, you see that lead's not on there at all, because while this has been prompted by the lead crisis, these interventions, like I said, the interventions around lead are not just for lead. And so the idea is to try to use this opportunity to help in a lot of different ways. So that's again why we focus on kids. And I think that that's a great place to stop. So what questions do you have?
All right, so as we get into questions, I'll pass around the mic. But I just want to remind everybody that we're going to have about an hour-long discussion afterwards, specifically for social workers who are here, about what you're seeing in practice, how we can get more connected as a community, how we can get engaged as a social work community here in Flint. So if you're able to stick around after that, as well as the Flint students, we're going to just do a little brief overview of their poster presentation. Before we get started here.
What was the name of the test that you were talking about, the survey?
The developmental screening?
No, the agency something questionnaire?
Oh, the ages and stages questionnaire,
Okay,
ASQ.
I'd like to ask a little question about the neurotoxin terminology. Neurotoxins mean that it kills neurons, right?
Neurotoxic actually means that it interferes with pathways in the brain. So it could be because it kills neurons, but it could also be because it interferes with signaling.
Okay, so it gets into neurotransmitter pathways, is what you're saying, as opposed to destroying neurons?
Correct. It's not known to destroy neurons directly. It interferes with the pathways and the signaling. So and if you're interested in reading like the papers on that, I can give you the net references on that. So, yeah, sorry, carry on. Did you have additional questions?
Is that seen as a permanent kind of a thing then?
Yeah, so so yes and no. So yes, just as any neurotoxin, so once damage is done to a signaling pathway or to a neuron itself, it is very difficult to undo that damage. That said, especially in children's brains, there's a great deal of what's called plasticity, which means that the brain can actually repair itself, or if not actually repair itself, kind of rebuild new structures and new connections around it. And that's actually even, we're learning even true in adults in some cases. So while the damage cannot be directly undone, the impact of that damage can be moderated, can be influenced by many of these interventions that we're talking about. Does that answer your question?
You were talking about the nutrition of value can help out with the lead poisoning, right? But how far can $10 go at the farmer's market? Why can't we have something more sustainable? Because there's a lot of people that I know from the community don't have access to get there. So what can we do to combat that issue?
Yeah. So Flint is a food desert. Are you familiar with that terminology? So that is something that absolutely should be acknowledged, and that is a huge problem, was already a huge problem. And I actually don't have like a specific project in mind around that, but I will say that, I mean, you're right, like yes, like you're right, that is absolutely something that needs to be tackled. I do know that that is a part of what, so there's a group called the Flint Community Resilience Group, SCRG, that is a very broad-based group. They meet weekly at the American Red Cross. SAMHSA was involved in facilitating their organization at the beginning, but they're now completely community-run. And I know that one of their many working groups is aimed around the health impacts, the physical health impacts, and they're looking at nutrition. So they would be a group I would hope was thinking about, again, the long-term sustainability. I mean, I would love to talk with you about that at length. I think beyond a lot of, frankly, big level, big capital P policy, how to fix that at a sustainable level. That said, I think in the meantime, these Band-Aid programs, which they are, I will acknowledge, like smoothie demonstration, that kind of thing, provide some assistance, but they're absolutely not the long-term answer. Sorry that I can't be more specific about it.
Kind of to piggyback off of what he's asking is, are there concerns with watering gardens, or community gardens
Yeah,
with the weather water?
So that's a great question. And I don't know the latest data on that. I need to look that up again. But my understanding is that in most fruits and vegetables, the plants don't pull the lead up because it's not something that they require or that they even know what to do with. So it shouldn't be like within the plant. Of course, if you're watering the plant, it could be on the outside. And so scrubbing your fruits and vegetables with non-lead contaminated water makes sense. That said, the amount of lead that would possibly be on the outside of the vegetable or a fruit is at a level so pretty, I would say that, so it's all about risk, right? And I would say it's pretty low risk. It's not zero risk, but it's low. It is unlikely to be within the vegetable or fruit. If that makes sense. I'm waiting for the wait. I've been told to wait.
I got one more question.
Okay.
I'm a lot older, I'm 54 years old, and I was thinking about something you said, a part of the brain that handles executive decision making. I remember when I was younger, I did a lot of stupid things, so would it be put in place, like you said, the 20-year plan, but would it put in place to, to step in, to be prepared for what's going to happen? Because, like you said, IQ levels are, lower and things like that. And with that part of the brain, the frontal lobe, executive decision making is, you don't really mature to age 21. So you go from teenage years, when, peer
You know,
pressure.
in the frontal lobe, yeah.
Yes, and then, you got peer pressure, you mentioned environmental factors and things like that. So how do we prepare ourselves as a community for this problem that's going to be the real major issue once the problem we have with lead is fixed?
Yes. So, this lead exposure and the approach to fixing this problem is definitely going to be a marathon and not a sprint. And you're absolutely correct that whatever programming and interventions and approaches, et cetera, that we put into place need to not just be for the next few months or the next few years, but for decades. That's absolutely true. Some of the things on the medical behavioral side that I'm more familiar with, so I think a lot about capacity and the system level. That's what I think about. And so one of the things that I've been advocating for, and that others have also, is for this sort of near universal assessment of folks, voluntary. But because to know what the problems may be, we need to know how people are doing. And so that's one of the reasons why the school system and the health system and the mental health system are trying to figure out how to do this, to offer this assessment piece in the fall. That would be universally available, offered. And then that lets us, and then the reason the schools were initially a little hesitant about that, understandably, is because frankly, any problems that we identify may have some impact on the medical system, but are definitely going to have an impact on the education system. And suddenly all those kids who we have assessed and who we have said have attention issues or IQ issues or what have you are going to need IEPs and resources and et cetera, and that doesn't exist right now. But I think most of the folks in the school district have come around to the idea that that need's going to be there no matter what, and if we can identify it, then we actually have some leverage to build the capacity. And then specifically on the developmental behavioral medical side, we at Hurley, Michigan State, Michigan-Flint, folks are actively recruiting around behavioral specialists, trying to figure out ways to get more bodies in the city, including everything from like fellowship programs to kind of thinking about if there's any way to become an federally qualified health center, and that could pull people. So there's a lot of people thinking about how to pull in people, not just in the short term, but in the long term. I know there were a few other folks.
I got a lineup.
There's a lineup, and I just had an FYI. So the group that you mentioned, the resiliency group or whatever,
Yeah.
their communications work group came up with a really good website. So in case people don't know, it's flintcares.com. And that gardening question you're asked is on there. That they answer those questions, and probably some other questions too you might have that may not be answered here. So flintcares.com.
Thank you. Just so I have an idea, how much time do we have for?
We have 10 more minutes.
Okay, great.
Okay, Ted, just a couple of parts to it. I am in no way a health insurance expert, but how has the health insurance expanded to allow Flint residents to even go to Hurley Clinic? Because I know a lot of things are not covered there, so most of the families will attend like a So would those services for the fresh fruit, vegetable prescription be available at like Hamilton Clinic? And
Okay, did you say there were two parts?
yes.
Okay, so first, kind of Medicaid insurance coverage, Medicaid, how will that impact the nutrition prescription? Will other clinics be doing it? So Medicaid expansion is now, the waiver is up to 21 years now, so that's huge. Hurley Primary Care Clinic does accept Medicaid. I know the subspecialists are all different, but Hurley Primary Care Clinic, which is the ones giving out these prescriptions, mostly do accept Medicaid, and Medicaid will, actually the insurance, who your insurance provider is currently doesn't matter for the prescription because it's grant funded, it's not being billed to the insurance. For long-term sustainability, we'll absolutely need to advocate that Medicaid and other providers cover kinds of things like this. That's why we're gathering data and hoping to be able to show that it's having an impact. Because it's grant funded right now, I would not expect to see the same model at other clinics. I think one of the things that Dr. Hanatisha is hoping to do is, again, like through CHAP and other organizations, kind of show this model to other folks and say, is there a way we can help you make this work, that kind of thing. Hurley just started it 4 weeks ago, so that expansion may take some time. But the other way to do it would be to go to the insurers directly and say, look, this is something you should cover, because then anybody could do it, right? So, second question?
That was.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So right now, as far as I know, it's only available at Hurley. So we'd love it to be other places.
Actually, that was the same question.
Oh, okay.
That she just asked. But in looking at, when I was looking at your PowerPoint, and you talked about the researchers at Wayne State
Yeah.
finding elevated lead levels in moms. I don't know whether that was pregnant moms or just in moms, and how that could affect their unborn child and then their child's unborn child. How do we track that?
So so there's two things there actually. So one is that if if a woman has been lead exposed, chronically lead exposed, she and anyone but likely has lead stored in their bones, because that's one of the places it goes. And unfortunately, in times of stress, it is likely that lead comes back into the bloodstream, and lead can cross the placenta. So hypothetically, this is all based on how we know the systems work, not necessarily based on actually testing individual people and demonstrating that this is what's happening, but hypothetically, pregnancy is definitely, that's not hypothetical, pregnancy is definitely a stressful time, and so both mentally and physically, and so hypothetically, then the lead that is in the bones could go into the blood, cross the placenta, and expose the unborn baby. Certainly, if a mother is actively lead exposed and is actively drinking water, it will go across the placenta. So that's one way that even if a woman is not being actively lead exposed, if she has lead in her bones, it may expose her baby. That said, I don't think that is a way, again, it's all risk, and I don't think that is necessarily something that women should have to consider when deciding if they want to have a kid or not, but just to put that out there. The children's children idea is that idea of the epigenetics and how there is evidence that lead impacts the machinery that interprets the genetic code, and that difference hypothetically can get passed down through generation, even if those people are not lead exposed. There's huge implications in that. It's something that there's actually, I know that there are grants out from Wayne State and from Michigan State, like applying for federal money to study that very thing, and to find out what's really going on. But it would obviously take a lot of time, right? Because it's not just, it can't just be like even just a few years study. Yeah, very long longitudinal study. So,
So those grandkids would have to know that their mom
right.
was
So
exposed in
yeah.
order to.
So this is, now I'm going on to areas I'm not an expert in, but my understanding is that there are ways for these scientists to look at the machinery, the proteins, and sort of by how they look, know whether you were exposed, and then they can track those changes in other people. That is my understanding. Yes.
Yes. First, I want to thank you for all that you're doing.
Sure.
Seems awesome. But express a concern about public schools and not just the assessment piece that's being planned, but trauma-informed interventions that could be occurring right now.
Yes.
To explain all of this to the students in schools and provide mental health support for those kids who are anxious and
Thank you for bringing up trauma-informed care because that is hugely important in Flint anyway. And as I mentioned a couple of times, and as you all know, this has been an additional trauma, certainly a traumatic event. So there are three current efforts that I know specifically around trauma and lead. One is that actually within the FCRG, so there's probably more information on flintcare.com. FlintCare or FlintCares?
Flint Cares.
FlintCares.com. But what I know about that is that there is a working group specifically around trauma in that body, and that GHS is the facilitator of that group, though it has members from the community and all kinds of organizations. They are not specifically focused on kids, though kids are included. It's really about everybody. So they have been working on different interventions that will be coming out mostly through GHS. That's one. Two is that a group from U of M Ann Arbor, actually, that already does kind of basically like telephone psychiatry consults throughout the state and has recently started doing this in Flint, has been tasked by the state to disseminate materials, already created materials around lead. For example, they developed a coloring book. I've seen it, pretty cute. It's not perfect. I'm not sure how there's some questions I have about its effectiveness, but it's a great, it's a good idea. Has a lot of activities and stuff. Definitely would work most effectively if a parent was doing it with the child. That's not exactly how it's designed. So then the third effort is that there are, and I apologize, I'm blanking on their names, but two national experts on trauma who have been involved in creating books, basically, that are distributed after disasters. And the woman whose name is escaping me is an expert in developing this curriculum for natural disasters. So she was involved in post-Hurricane Katrina, for example. And then the guy who's involved is their expert on man-caused disasters. So ranging from 9/11 to other things. So they are working to develop a book that that would be distributed around lead and around lead exposure. And I can just, again, I've seen their other materials, they're beautiful and they're very well designed to be used. They're like a picture book to be used with a parent and a child together. So it's a 2-generation intervention. And then they've developed some of the content of the book, like the text of the book, and it's right on. Their facts are all right. So I'm very excited to see what they come up with. That is further behind those other ones. So yes, it is something people are aware of. It is not my area of expertise, so that's not something I'm directly working on, but I try to keep aware of what else is going on.
My question is for adults exposed to
Yeah.
lead. Like I had my blood tested and I was a 7.
Yeah.
Okay, so what can I do to limit the effects of the lead in my body?
Yeah, good nutrition, great nutrition. So drink your milk, calcium and iron are the things to really focus on. And then beyond that, I would say, you're less likely to have the behavioral or emotional impacts of the lead that a kid would have because the structures that regulate those things are already hypothetically, I'm presuming, hypothetically formed for you, sir. And so probably what you already have is what you're going to get. And therefore, I would say, the best thing to do is good nutrition, and then just really good self-care. I'm trying to think of how to translate effective parenting behaviors to you, to all of us. So I think the idea is make sure that you are handling stress in a healthy way. Make sure that that's the big one, honestly, because the toxic stress impacts the system. So good nutrition and healthy handling of stress. And again, at cliniccares.com, they have, I know that they have, that one of the work groups is directly looking at that, actually related to the trauma groups, where they have mindfulness classes and what they call psychological first aid and information about how we can take care of ourselves and help take care of our neighbors so that we have our own best outcomes. So thank you for asking that question, because I am obviously biased towards the children, but we are all Thank you.
So we have one last question before we have to wrap up for tonight.
2 things. One real quickly is there's an app called Empower Flint that is really cool, and it gives water locations, pick up information, drop off bottles, and also information on how the water affects pets. And then secondly, in your involvement with getting the ASQ developmental screener out there, please consider also adding the ages and stages SE, social emotional.
Check. Okay. Thank you. You're on the
What was her list on?
So the ages and stages questionnaire was originally developed as a screener for the 4 main domains of development: language, cognitive, motor, large motor and fine motor. And then more recently, the people who developed it have created a supplement screener that looks specifically at social emotional development, which you might argue is even more important in this population.
Wonderful. Can we give Dr. O'Connell a round?